John Cena thought it would be just another quiet morning, but fate had other plans. When danger strikes and injustice looms, will he stand aside or fight back? What happens next will leave you speechless. Watch till the end to witness the shocking turn of events. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. The early morning air was crisp as John Cena jogged through the nearly empty streets of the city. He appreciated moments like these, the quiet before the chaos of the day, before the world fully woke up and the constant rush of fame surrounded him. His movements were smooth and controlled, his breath steady. Years of discipline had shaped his body into a machine of endurance and power, but in moments like this, he was just a man enjoying a run. After finishing his usual route, he slowed his pace as he approached a small cafe tucked into the corner of a quiet street. He had never been here before, but it looked inviting, with a warm glow spilling from its windows and the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting into the street. More importantly, it looked peaceful. That was all he wanted, a simple cup of coffee in solitude before the day demanded more of him. As he stepped inside, the soft chime of the door signaled his arrival. The cafe was relatively empty, just a handful of customers scattered about. By the window, an elderly black woman sat alone, her attention focused on a book in her hands. She exuded a quiet dignity, the kind of presence that commanded respect without needing to demand it. John moved toward the counter, ordering a large black coffee before taking a seat in the back corner. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through unread messages and news updates, blending into the background like any ordinary customer. He had hoped to remain unnoticed, but after a few moments, he felt a pair of eyes on him. Looking up, he met the gaze of the elderly woman. There was a knowing glint in her eyes as if she recognized him but was debating whether to say anything. After a moment, she closed her book and stood, slowly making her way toward his table with a small smile. "Excuse me, young man," she said in a voice that carried both warmth and wisdom. "Are you John Cena?" John tilted his cap slightly, leaning forward with a playful smirk. "Me? No, I'm just a guy who loves coffee. But if I were John Cena, I'd ask you to keep that a secret, okay?" She chuckled, shaking her head. "Now, son, I may be old, but I'm not blind. I know John Cena when I see him." John laughed at her persistence, nodding. "All right, you got me." She smiled warmly. "I thought so. My grandson used to watch you wrestle all the time. You've done good work outside the ring, too. The world needs more people like that." John felt a sense of genuine appreciation in her words. She wasn't here to fan over him or ask for a picture for social media. She simply respected him as a person. That was rare. "Thank you," he said sincerely. She reached into her bag and pulled out a book. "Would you mind signing this? Not for me, my grandson. He passed away some years ago, but he would have loved to know I met you." John took the book carefully, reading the title before pulling out a pen. It would be an honor. He flipped to a blank page and wrote a short message before signing his name. "For a grandson whose spirit still shines bright." She read the words and nodded, clearly touched. "Thank you, John." Their moment of peace, however, was shattered by the abrupt creak of the cafe door swinging open roughly. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately as 5 men walked in, their presence drawing the attention of everyone inside. They were bikers, dressed in worn leather jackets adorned with patches, their boots heavy against the tiled floor. Tattoos curled up their arms, and their smug expressions carried an air of menace. The elderly woman's warm expression faded, replaced by quiet unease. John remained calm, His posture relaxed, but his senses sharpened. He had encountered men like these before, bullies who thrived on intimidation. One of the bikers, a stocky man with fiery red hair, nudged his companion and gestured toward John. "Hey, ain't that the big movie star? The tough guy who thinks he's a real fighter?" he said loudly, drawing laughter from the others. John didn't react. He simply took another sip of his coffee, pretending not to hear them. A taller, more muscular biker took a step closer, sneering. "Well, well, look who we've got here. Big, bad John Cena. Bet you think you're a real hero, huh?" The elderly woman, still holding her book, frowned but said nothing. John set his coffee down, glancing at them for the first time. His voice was steady. "I'm just here to enjoy my coffee. No trouble." But trouble had already found him. The bikers weren't interested in leaving him alone. They surrounded his table, their laughter growing louder. The leader of the group, a tall man with a skull tattoo on his neck, leaned in close. "What's the matter, Cena? You not so tough without your cameras and stunt doubles?" Before John could respond, the red-haired biker turned to the elderly woman. His grin widened. "Hey, lady, you a big fan of Cena? Want an autograph?" She didn't answer. His grin turned meaner. "Here, let me help." He grabbed John's coffee cup and, before anyone could react, tilted it forward, dumping the contents onto the elderly woman's lap. The cafe fell into stunned silence. She gasped, not from pain, but from the sheer disrespect. Her book slipped from her hands, landing in the puddle of spilled coffee. John's expression didn't change, at least not visibly, but inside something shifted. The red-haired biker smirked. "Oops, guess you should have kept your mouth shut, lady." John stood up slowly. The laughter from the bikers faded. The air grew heavy with tension. The cafe's customers sat frozen in their seats, waiting. John's voice was quiet but firm. "That's enough." The red-haired biker scoffed. "Or what?" John picked up the elderly woman's book, carefully placing it on a dry part of the table before turning to face them fully. His posture shifted slightly, his body language changing in an almost imperceptible way. The atmosphere in the cafe became charged. Everyone could feel it, like the moment before a thunderstorm broke loose. The bikers exchanged glances, their cocky smirks faltering for the first time. Then the leader of the group smirked again. "Oh yeah? And what are you going to do about it?" John didn't answer. He didn't need to. The storm had already arrived. The cafe was silent, the tension hanging thick in the air like a coiled spring waiting to snap. The bikers' smirks were still there, but they weren't as confident as before. John Cena stood tall, his frame casting a shadow over the red-haired biker who had just spilled coffee on the elderly woman. His expression was unreadable, his movements controlled, but the weight of his presence had changed. The air in the cafe felt heavier now. Everyone inside knew what was coming, even the bikers, though they were too proud to admit it. The leader of the group, the man with the skull tattoo on his neck, stepped closer, sneering. "What's the matter, Cena? You upset about your little fan?" His voice dripped with mockery, but his body language betrayed the slightest hint of hesitation. John remained still, his eyes locked onto the red-haired biker who had disrespected the elderly woman. He didn't look at the others. Not yet. He simply reached out, picked up her book from the table, and handed it back to her with careful precision. She took it, her hands trembling slightly, but she didn't look afraid. She looked furious. "You should apologize," John said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made it impossible to ignore. The red-haired biker snorted, rolling his eyes. Or what? That was the last thing he said before it all went wrong for them. John moved faster than any of them could react. His hand shot forward, gripping the red-haired biker's wrist in an iron hold. Before the man could even struggle, John twisted it sharply, forcing the biker to his knees with a sharp grunt of pain. His smirk disappeared, replaced by wide-eyed shock. The leader of the group barely had time to react before John turned his head slightly, his cold gaze landing on him. The skull-tattooed man lunged forward, swinging a fist toward John's face, but John sidestepped effortlessly, catching the incoming arm and redirecting the momentum. The biker's own weight sent him crashing against a table, knocking over a chair as he groaned in pain. The other 3 bikers didn't wait. They all moved at once. The stocky one with tattoos up his arms grabbed a chair and swung it, aiming for John's head. John ducked at the last moment, the chair whistling through the air harmlessly before shattering against the wall. Before the biker could recover, John delivered a swift kick to his knee, dropping him to the ground with a pained yelp. The next biker, a wiry man with a scar running across his cheek, was smarter. He didn't go for brute force. Instead, he reached for the knife hidden at his belt and lunged. The blade flickered in the dim light of the cafe, slicing toward John's ribs, but John had seen it coming. He stepped inside the attack, catching the biker's wrist in one hand and twisting it brutally. The knife clattered to the floor as the biker howled in pain, his arm locked in a tight hold. John didn't waste time. He shoved the man backward, sending him stumbling over an overturned chair. The last biker, the tallest and most muscular, hesitated. He looked around at his fallen friends, then back at John, who hadn't even broken a sweat. His fists clenched, his jaw tightening as he weighed his options. He made the wrong choice. With a roar, the big man rushed forward, throwing a wild punch. John ducked, sidestepping and using the man's own momentum against him. He grabbed the biker's arm mid-swing, turned his body, and sent the man flying over his shoulder in a perfect judo throw. The biker crashed onto the hard tile floor with a thud that made the cafe windows rattle. He groaned, rolling onto his side, defeated. Silence. All 5 bikers lay groaning, barely able to move, the remnants of their arrogance shattered on the cafe floor. The customers, who had been frozen in fear, began to stir. A few of them pulled out their phones, their screens glowing as they recorded the aftermath. John exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He turned to the elderly woman who was still sitting at the table, her gaze locked onto him. There was no fear in her eyes, just quiet approval. The cafe manager, a middle-aged woman who had been hiding behind the counter, peeked out cautiously before stepping forward. She looked at the mess, the broken chairs, the spilled coffee, the groaning men on the floor, and then at John. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady. I don't know how to thank you," she stammered. John shook his head. Just glad no one got hurt. But it wasn't over yet. A distant noise broke through the stunned silence, the wail of police sirens. The red and blue lights reflected off the cafe windows as squad cars screeched to a halt outside. The battered bikers stirred, their groans turning into low curses. The leader, still clutching his jaw where John had struck him, shot him a glare filled with hatred and humiliation. "This isn't over," he spat through gritted teeth. John tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Oh, it is." The doors burst open as uniformed officers flooded inside, weapons drawn. They took in the scene. 5 men lying beaten on the floor, the cafe in disarray, and John Cena standing calmly amidst the chaos. Recognition flickered in their eyes, but they remained professional. One officer, a tall man with a buzz cut, approached. Mr. Cena, do you want to press charges? John glanced at the bikers. They already looked humiliated enough. He shook his head. No need. They already got what they deserved. The officer hesitated, then nodded. Understood. The bikers were hauled to their feet, their wrists locked in handcuffs. Some of them tried to struggle, but they were too beaten to put up much resistance. As they were led out of the cafe, the leader shot one last venomous look at John. "You'll pay for this," he growled. John met his gaze, calm as ever. "You already did." The elderly woman chuckled softly at that, shaking her head in amusement. As the last of the bikers were dragged outside, the tension in the cafe finally began to lift. The customers started whispering, some of them approaching John to thank him, others simply in awe of what they had just witnessed. The manager, still flustered, hesitated before clearing her throat. "Mr. Cena, I don't suppose you'd like free coffee for life?" John chuckled, shaking his head. "I'll keep that in mind." He turned back to the elderly woman, crouching slightly so they were at eye level. "You okay?" She nodded. "I am now. You, young man, are full of surprises." John smiled. "You stood up to them first. That takes more courage than you think." She looked down at her book, the one that had nearly been ruined. "It's a shame about the coffee." John reached into his bag, pulling out a fresh notebook. He flipped to the first page and scribbled something down before handing it to her. "For the bravest person in the room," he said with a small smile. Her eyes widened as she read the words, her face lighting up with a mix of awe and gratitude. "Thank you, John." John tipped his cap slightly before turning toward the door. The cafe had begun to settle again, customers returning to their seats, the buzz of conversation picking up. As he stepped outside into the bright morning sun, he took a deep breath, letting the tension leave his body. But something felt off. A strange sensation crawled up his spine, a gut feeling honed over years of experience. Someone was watching him. He didn't need to look to know that this wasn't over. The morning sun cast long shadows on the pavement as John Cena stepped out of the cafe. The tension from the fight still lingered in his muscles, but he had learned long ago not to let adrenaline cloud his mind. His instincts were telling him something. This wasn't over. He took a deep breath, adjusting his cap as he started walking down the quiet street. Behind him, the cafe door swung shut, and the murmurs of astonished customers faded into the background. But he knew that wasn't the only thing behind him. His steps were steady, casual, but his ears were sharp. The sound of boots against concrete. A presence lingering just beyond his peripheral vision. Someone was following him. He glanced at the reflection in a nearby shop window. Two men, both wearing the same leather jackets as the bikers from earlier. The two who had managed to slip away before the police arrived. They were hanging back, watching him, their movements cautious but determined. John kept walking, keeping his pace even, but he was already assessing his surroundings. The street was mostly empty, the early morning rush still an hour away. A few parked cars, some closed storefronts, an alley up ahead. He took note of every detail, every potential obstacle. He had dealt with men like this before, ones who thought a cheap shot or an ambush would give them the upper hand. They never learned. The sound of an engine revving made him subtly shift his focus. Up ahead, at the end of the street, two motorcycles came to life. Their riders wore matching jackets, their engines growling like hungry beasts. The bikers were boxing him in, cutting off his escape route. A classic setup. He sighed. Some people just didn't know when to quit. He stopped walking, standing in the middle of the empty sidewalk, His hands relaxed at his sides. The two men behind him slowed their approach, their footsteps more deliberate now. The bikers on the motorcycles revved their engines, inching forward, hemming him in. The wiry one with the scar was the first to speak. "You embarrassed us back there, Cena," he sneered, voice dripping with venom. "Made us look weak in front of all those people." John turned his head slightly, just enough to see them without fully facing them. His expression remained unreadable. "You did that all on your own." The burly biker, the one who had grabbed the chain earlier, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "Now you're gonna pay for it," he growled. John exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. "Are you sure you want to do this?" The wiry biker grinned, pulling a heavy chain from his belt. The metal links clinked ominously as he let it dangle from his fingers. "Yeah," he said, "we do." The motorcycles roared as their riders revved their engines again, waiting for the right moment to strike. John stayed where he was, his feet planted firmly on the ground. He had been in enough fights to know that running wasn't an option. These men weren't here to scare him, they were here to hurt him. But they had made a critical mistake. They thought he was the one in danger. The wiry biker swung the chain in a wide arc, aiming for John's midsection. But John was already moving. He stepped to the side at the last possible second, his hand shooting out to grab the chain midair. The biker's smug grin vanished as John yanked the chain forward, pulling the man off balance. In one fluid motion, he drove his knee into the biker's ribs. A choked gasp of pain followed as the man collapsed onto one knee, clutching his side. The burly biker took his chance, charging forward with a wild swing. John ducked under the punch, letting the momentum throw his attacker off balance. He twisted his body, delivering a sharp elbow to the man's ribs before following up with a precise uppercut to the jaw. The biker staggered back, eyes dazed, his hands instinctively reaching for his face. One of the bikers on the motorcycle saw his chance and gunned the engine, accelerating straight toward John, hoping to ram him. But John had been waiting for this. He waited until the last possible second, then sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing a loose piece of pipe from the ground as he moved. As the motorcycle sped past, he swung. The pipe connected with the front wheel, sending the biker flying over the handlebars. The man crashed onto the pavement with a painful thud, groaning as he rolled onto his side. The last biker, still on his motorcycle, skidded to a stop. His face twisted with rage as he reached for a knife strapped to his belt, pointing it toward John. "You think you're tough?" he spat. "Without your movie tricks, you're just another old man." John tilted his head slightly. "And yet, here you are, on the ground." The biker let out a roar of frustration and lunged forward, slashing the knife toward John's torso. John caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting it hard. The knife clattered onto the pavement as John drove his fist into the biker's stomach, doubling him over. With a firm grip, he grabbed the man by the collar and flung him backward. The biker hit the ground hard, gasping for air. Silence settled over the street. The fight was over. John looked around. The four bikers lay groaning on the pavement, defeated. The motorcycles idled, their engines still humming, but their riders were no longer a threat. A few people had gathered at a safe distance, their phones out, recording every second of what had just happened. The burly biker, still clutching his ribs, glared at John from the ground. "You'll regret this," he snarled. John stepped forward, standing over him. His voice was calm, controlled. "I already do." The biker flinched. He knew he had lost. He scrambled to his feet, helping the wiry biker up as the others groaned in defeat. They saw the onlookers, the cameras, the undeniable proof of their humiliation. The burly one spat on the ground, his hands shaken with fury, but he didn't say another word. He just turned and limped toward his motorcycle. The others followed. Engines roared to life, and within moments they were gone, disappearing down the street like a fading storm. John exhaled slowly, feeling the tension leave his body. He turned to the crowd. Some people were still staring. Some were murmuring. A young man approached hesitantly, his phone still recording. "That was insane," he said, eyes wide with disbelief. "You're like a real-life action hero." John gave him a small smile. "Just a guy trying to do the right thing." The young man nodded, still clearly in awe, before walking back to join the others. John glanced down at his knuckles. No cuts, no bruises. He had handled it efficiently, like always, but something still felt unfinished. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from his assistant reminding him of an upcoming meeting. John sighed, slipping the phone back into his pocket. There was always something, always more to do. As he turned and walked down the street, the echoes of the fight faded behind him. The bikers were gone, but he knew their kind. This wasn't over. Not really. But for now, the city was safe. The elderly woman was safe. And that was enough. John Cena kept his pace steady as he walked down the city street. The fight had ended, but his instincts told him the trouble wasn't over. He had dealt with men like those bikers before, men who let their pride and anger cloud their judgment. They wouldn't take their defeat lightly. But for now, the streets were quiet. The city was waking up. Cars passed by, pedestrians moved along the sidewalks, oblivious to what had just happened. As John turned the corner, he spotted a small group of children playing hopscotch on the sidewalk. Among them, standing out immediately, was the elderly woman from the cafe, Miss Ruby. She was watching the children with a gentle smile, her book now safely tucked under her arm. The coffee stains from earlier were still visible on her dress, but she seemed unbothered, as if the events of the morning had only strengthened her resolve. John slowed his pace, watching as she spoke animatedly to one of the children, a boy in a red cap who looked to be around 10 years old. The boy's eyes widened as Miss Ruby held up her book, pointing to something inside. The other children gathered around, listening intently. John recognized the look on their faces. Awe, admiration. He took a step closer, making his presence known. The children turned in unison, their gazes snapping to him, their expressions shifting from curiosity to excitement. There was a beat of silence, then an explosion of chatter. "Whoa, it's really him!" the boy in the red cap gasped. John smiled slightly, nodding to the group. "Hey there." Miss Ruby grinned and stepped forward. "John, I was just telling them about you." John crouched slightly so he was at eye level with the children. "Is that so?" he said, his voice warm. "And what exactly were you telling them?" The boy in the red cap spoke first. "That you beat up all those bad guys. That you're the strongest person in the world." John chuckled, shaking his head. "I think you're giving me too much credit." The youngest girl in the group, no older than 7, hesitated before speaking up. "Did you really fight them all by yourself?" John leaned back slightly, considering the question. "Well," he said, "I had a little help." He nodded toward Miss Ruby. "Sometimes standing up and speaking out is the hardest part, and she nailed it." The children turned to Miss Ruby, their admiration now shifting to her. She blushed slightly, but stood a little taller, clearly proud of herself. The boy in the red cap looked thoughtful. So, you don't have to fight to be strong? John nodded. The best way to fight bad guys is to not let them win in the first place. You don't always have to throw punches to be strong. Sometimes just standing up for what's right is enough. The children nodded, as if absorbing his words. Miss Ruby looked at him with a knowing smile, her eyes filled with quiet appreciation. After a moment, the young girl who had spoken up earlier took a hesitant step forward. Do you think I could be a hero someday? John studied her for a moment before answering. You already are. Her eyes widened, her small hands gripping the edges of her dress. Being a hero isn't about fighting, John continued. It's about helping people. It's about standing up for what's right. And you can do that at any age. The girl's face lit up at his words. For the first time since the cafe, she let out a small laugh. Thanks, Mr. Cena. I think I'll try to remember that. John smiled. Good, and call me John. The boy in the red cap grinned. Wow, Miss Ruby, you really are lucky. I wish I had a hero like that. John stood adjusting his cap. You don't need to be lucky, he said. You just need to be willing to do the right thing when it counts. The group of kids beamed at his words, clearly taking them to heart. Miss Ruby clutched her book tightly, as if it now carried more meaning than just an autograph. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the distant sound of sirens. John's expression hardened slightly as he turned his head toward the noise. The events of the morning flashed through his mind. The bikers wouldn't give up easily. He knew that. But for now, the streets were quiet, the children were safe, Miss Ruby was safe, and that was enough. He looked back at her one last time. Take care of yourself, Miss Ruby. She nodded enthusiastically. I will, and I'll make you proud. John grinned. You already have. With that, he turned and began walking down the street, disappearing into the rhythm of the city. The children waved as he left, their voices filled with excitement and admiration. As John walked, he reflected on the events of the day. The fight with the bikers was just another challenge, another moment in a lifetime of standing up against injustice. But the real victory wasn't in the fight. It was in the way Miss Ruby had stood up for herself. It was in the confidence shining in the children's eyes. Strength wasn't just about power. It was about knowing when to use it. It was about inspiring others to find their own. And, as long as he could, he would continue to do just that. John Cena continued walking down the sidewalk, his footsteps steady as the echoes of the morning's events faded behind him. The sun had risen higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. The city had returned to its usual rhythm, cars passing by, people moving about their day, oblivious to what had unfolded just moments ago. Despite the apparent calm, John remained aware, his instincts telling him to stay alert. He had dealt with men like the bikers before, and he knew they wouldn't forget what had happened. But that was a problem for another time. As he made his way down the street, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message from his assistant reminding him of an upcoming meeting. He sighed and slipped the phone back into his pocket. There was always something, always more to do. But at least for now, things seemed to be settling down. Up ahead, he spotted Miss Ruby standing at the edge of a small park, watching the world pass by. She seemed at peace, despite everything that had happened earlier. John approached her, and she turned toward him with a warm smile. "Heading somewhere important?" she asked, her tone light. John shrugged. "Just another meeting. You know how it is." She chuckled. I imagine your kind of meetings involve more action than mine ever did. John smiled. Depends on the day. She studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. You know, young man, I've seen a lot of things in my time. People who stand up when it matters, and people who turn away. What you did today, that's rare. Not just the fighting, the way you carried yourself, the way you made sure I was okay first. John nodded. It wasn't right what they did to you. Someone had to step in. Miss Ruby tapped her book against her palm. And yet, most wouldn't have. It's easy to ignore trouble when it's not your own. John tilted his head slightly. Maybe, but I don't believe in standing by when I can do something about it. She smiled approvingly. That's a rare thing these days. John glanced around, noticing the park was mostly empty, except for a few joggers and an elderly couple sitting on a bench. You come here often? Miss Ruby nodded. Every morning. It's my quiet place. Reminds me that the world isn't all bad. John smirked. Yeah? Even after today? She laughed. Especially after today. I saw something worth believing in. John felt the weight of her words settle over him. He wasn't the type to seek praise, but hearing it from someone like her meant something. She wasn't just thanking him for what he had done. She was reminding him why he did it in the first place. A distant noise caught his attention, the low, rumbling growl of motorcycle engines. His body tensed slightly, his mind already assessing the situation before he even turned to look. The sound grew louder, closer. A glance over his shoulder confirmed it. 3 motorcycles rolling down the street, their riders clad in familiar leather jackets. They weren't the same bikers from earlier, but they were cut from the same cloth. Miss Ruby noticed his change in posture. Trouble? John exhaled slowly. Maybe. The motorcycles slowed as they approached, their riders scanning the area. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, locked eyes with John and smirked. He nodded to his companions, and the 3 of them coasted to a stop just a few feet away. Well, well, the bearded man said, swinging his leg over his bike as he stepped off. Didn't expect to find you so soon, Cena. John remained still, his expression neutral. Something I can help you with? The man crossed his arms. Word's gotten around about what happened this morning. You made some enemies. John sighed. Seems to be a theme today. The other 2 bikers dismounted, their hands resting near their belts. They weren't making a move yet, but their body language was clear. They were looking for a fight. Miss Ruby took a step closer to John, lowering her voice. I can call someone. John shook his head slightly. No need. The bearded man tilted his head. You think you're tough, Cena? Taking down a few of our guys doesn't make you untouchable. John met his gaze evenly. I don't think I'm untouchable, but I do think you're making a mistake. The bearded man chuckled. Oh yeah? And why's that? John took a step forward, his stance solid. Because you don't want this fight. You think you do, but you don't. The tension crackled between them. The bikers glanced at each other, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. They had expected fear, hesitation. Instead, they were met with absolute confidence. The bearded man's smirk faltered for a split second before he forced it back. We'll see about that. One of the bikers reached for something inside his jacket. John moved before he could. In a single fluid motion, he closed the distance, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. A switchblade clattered to the pavement. John released him just as fast, sending him stumbling backward. The second biker lunged, swinging a wild punch. John sidestepped, caught his arm, and used his own momentum against him, flipping him over his shoulder. The biker crashed onto the pavement with a grunt. The bearded man cursed and threw a punch, but John blocked it easily. He countered with a swift strike to the ribs, followed by a precise uppercut. The biker staggered back, clutching his side, his breath coming in sharp gasps. John stepped back, letting them take in their defeat. "Still think this was a good idea?" The bearded man's expression darkened, but he didn't try to fight again. He glanced at his fallen companions, then back at John. His jaw clenched. "This isn't over." John exhaled, shaking his head. "It is if you walk away now." The bearded man hesitated, then spat on the ground. He turned and climbed back onto his bike. "Let's go," he growled. The other two scrambled to their feet, limping back to their motorcycles. Within moments, they were gone, their engines roaring as they disappeared down the street. John turned to Miss Ruby. "You all right?" She smiled, completely unfazed. "I told you, young man. I've seen a lot of things in my time. This was just another morning." John chuckled. "Something tells me it won't be the last." She gave him a knowing look. "And something tells me you wouldn't have it any other way." John sighed, adjusting his cap. "Maybe not." She patted his arm. "Well, if you ever need a reminder of why you do what you do, you know where to find me." John nodded. "I'll keep that in mind." With one last glance down the street, he turned and walked away, the city swallowing him back into its rhythm. The fight had ended, but something told him it wouldn't be the last time trouble found him. And that was fine. Because as long as there were people like Miss Ruby who needed someone to stand up, he'd be there, no matter what. The fight may be over, but the battle for justice never truly ends. John Cena proved that true strength isn't just about power. It's about standing up when it matters most. But is this really the end, or just the beginning of something bigger? Let us know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video.